Welcome to Beneath the Bible, where we're helping you dig deeper and uncover the world beneath the sacred book. The city of Sodom is one of the most notorious places in the Bible. It's famously destroyed with fire and brimstone in Genesis because it was such a sinful place. Abraham asked God to spare the city if he could find a righteous person there, but not a single righteous person could be found. Sodom has become a byword for sin, and its reputation has lasted for millennia. Now, the question for us when it comes to the Bible and archaeology is, if this city was destroyed by a literal act of God, then we should be able to find the city, right? But this is the apparent premise behind an article published in 2021 about a site called Tall el Hammam in what is now central Jordan. The article argues that an airburst event, like a meteor that blew up in the atmosphere before impact, destroyed the city. Now, that's a lot to argue for by itself. But the article also argues, though not quite as explicitly, that this site is the city of Sodom, and the destruction found at the site is the act of God described in Genesis. Now, as you can imagine, this article made some waves when it was first published, and while some of the excitement has since died down, it's popping back up on social media as a more popular audience is rediscovering it. So, today we wanted to give our unsolicited 2 cents and weigh in on the issue of whether archaeologists have found Sodom, or whether such a discovery is even possible. Let's dig in.
Is Tall el Hammam the biblical Sodom? Let's look at some of the evidence that is cited by the excavator of the site, Stephen Collins. So first, Tall el Hammam is an archaeological site in the modern state of Jordan. It's to the west of the modern cities of Amman and Madaba and just northeast of the current shore of the Dead Sea. Stephen Collins is very confident that this site is the biblical site of Sodom. As for why he thinks this, I group his arguments into 2 categories, those based on the text and geography and those based on archaeology. Put another way, he has some more general and some more specific arguments. First, he argues from the biblical evidence that the location of Sodom is north of the Dead Sea. Now, this is perhaps his most compelling argument. In Genesis 13, Lot and Abraham are meeting between the sites of Bethel and Ai and determining which land each will take. From there, Lot looks out over a plain, or in Hebrew the word kikar, and he sees that it's well watered. Now, there's also this curious parenthetical note about the time being before Sodom and Gomorrah were destroyed. So anyway, Lot looks at the kikar and chooses that land as his own, and from the area around Bethel, he moves east towards Sodom. Collins suggests kikar, which usually translated as the Jordan Valley or the plain, more specifically refers to the plain north of the Dead Sea. Kikar can refer to a region, but it also has other meanings like a loaf of bread or a talent, with the idea he suggests has something to do with roundness. And this fertile region north of the Dead Sea, really the north shore of the Dead Sea itself, is rounded and could fit well with this particular sense of kikar. Secondly, Collins knows that there are several Middle Bronze Age sites in the region, which is generally the chronological range of the age of the patriarchs. Sodom is always listed among other cities, or the cities of the plain, and is most closely linked with Gomorrah. As for Sodom, Collins suggests the site of Tall el Hammam is the Middle Bronze Age city, which should be identified as Sodom. Collins has been the lead excavator at the site for multiple seasons and has made some fairly sensational claims about the remains at the site, which he believes fit not only the geography of the site in the Bible, but also the destruction described in the Bible. In the course of the excavations, Collins reported a Middle Bronze Age city with a palatial complex and fortifications that were destroyed in a massive destruction event. The city was apparently destroyed in a massive conflagration as a stratum at the site ended in a large-scale event or series of events that destroyed the palace, burned pottery, and left uninterred skeletal remains. In this 2021 article published in Scientific Reports, which does not include Collins as an author, the claims that Tall el Hammam or Sodom really hit the wider world outside of the archaeological community. Now, we aren't going to go through all of their analysis here. We'll link the article in the description if you want to read it for yourself. There are several other places here on YouTube where you can hear very positive discussions of their evidence. But some of the highlights include the discovery of trinitite on the melted pottery. Trinitite is so named because it was recognized after the Trinity nuclear test, and it's formed during the extreme conditions of a nuclear explosion. Additionally, things like nanodiamonds and shocked quartz, both identified microscopically and taken as indicative of an airburst event, were reportedly found at the site. Human remains were found deposited underneath a layer of mud brick. No weapons were associated with the remains or the destruction. The ash and the charcoal of the destruction were able to be sampled for radiocarbon and are reported as uniformly dating to approximately 1650 BC. The conclusion of the article suggests an airburst event destroyed the site. Essentially, a meteor entered the atmosphere and exploded over the site, destroying the city in one cataclysmic event. Collins and the others suggest this is the mechanism by which God destroyed the city as recorded in Genesis. Now, those are some pretty sensational claims. As you can imagine, those claims were met with some skepticism. Personally, I do think that skepticism is warranted. A lot of the claims were addressed by academics on various social media platforms, and a lot of the critiques were not particularly charitable and included some really unnecessary ad hominem arguments. However, some serious problems with the paper were noted, including that some of the images and graphs were edited prior to publication, as in some of the data presented was ostensibly falsified. A number of edits and corrections were made to the original paper, and we'll also link those in the description below. And even with the corrections though, it's not a great look. But essentially, each of the big claims in the paper faced criticism. For example, the idea that the destruction at Tall el Hammam was a single episode where a large atmospheric blast buried the site has been critiqued by geomorphologists who identified a wind-blown layer in the photographs in the publications, suggesting there's a long exposure to the elements and weathering erosion after the destruction. They also critiqued the explanation for the directional destruction of the ceramic debris. The shocked quartz, which was linked to the explosive force of the proposed atmospheric explosion, may have been caused by other kinds of events. Things as mundane as lightning can cause it, or even tectonic activity in very tectonically active areas, like the Jordan Rift Valley. The radiocarbon results were also widely critiqued, as the authors ran a particular analysis that wasn't warranted. Not to get too inside baseball with the radiocarbon analysis, but essentially the team ran all of their samples on the assumption they were from a single episode, which gives you a chart that looks like this, which is not what they usually look like. And it's noteworthy that this is not an assumption many share about these carbon samples. They may in fact reflect a much longer period, which would make this analysis at best not helpful. Their analysis of the human remains has been critiqued on a variety of fronts, with some critiques being more convincing than others. The critiques that only a medical doctor or not a bioarchaeologist examine the remains essentially amounts to a pretty lame gatekeeping at best, and at worst is a classic case of the credentials fallacy, so that doesn't really convince me very much. However, I'm more receptive to the critique that not all of the proposed human remains are, in fact, human, and not other native species. Additionally, no proposed human remains were carbon dated, which also seems kind of significant. Even the claim that this was an airburst has been critiqued. In fact, this is perhaps the most significantly targeted area of critique, as a number of the authors on this paper are a part of what's called the Comet Research Group, whose research is controversial within a number of academic disciplines. So essentially, an archaeological paper got dragged into a much larger ongoing debate within the broader scientific community. As far as the impact hypothesis goes, those who study these kinds of events suggest that this is a very low probability event and shouldn't be the first hypothesis. Only when other options are ruled out should we look to the extraordinary. And furthermore, the evidence cited does not match particularly well with either the physics or evidence from other known airburst events. But even archaeologists are critical of the evidence cited. Destructions are a well-known category of events at ancient sites. Natural disasters like earthquakes are capable of destroying sites and causing fires, even unexpectedly intense fires. Not all combat-induced destructions leave behind enormous amounts of military implements. Sites throughout the Holy Land have massive destruction layers which look very similar to the ones at Tall el Hammam. And from our perspective, the destruction layer they're presenting isn't entirely exceptional. Multiple sites like Lachish, Gezer, Megiddo, Tel Asafi, and so many others have very significant destruction layers, and even multiple of them. And many have similar finds to Hammam with the vitrified mud brick and all the other things they cite. So if the specific claims around Hammam being Sodom are questioned by those within the field of archaeology and those outside of it, what about the more general claims about it based on the text and geography? Well, it's somewhat complicated. Collins' argument that the cities of the plain are in the plains north of the Dead Sea has something to be said for it. He may be right about that. But there are other reasons, even from within the text, that think we may want to find Sodom elsewhere. For example, the itinerary in Genesis 14 strongly indicates the kings of Sodom and Gomorrah are near the valley of Sodom, which had bitumen pits, and are south of a site called Hazazon Tamar, which is elsewhere in the Bible known as En Gedi. Now, this is a very well-known site located centrally on the Dead Sea, not in the north. And additionally, in Genesis 18:19, Abraham is at Mamre near Hebron and is visited by three figures who make their way to Sodom. We see in Genesis 18 that the visitors came to Abraham at Hebron during the heat of the day. They look toward Sodom, and by nightfall are at Sodom, where they are taken in by Lot. Now, you simply cannot see Hammam from Hebron, and the distance between Hebron to Hammam would present difficulties with the timeline of the text, given the distance. The bitumen pits of the valley and a more southern location for Sodom, given the distance between it and Hebron, has thus been the traditionally preferred location for Sodom. But before we discuss a few options for where Sodom may have been, we want to note some implications if we accept Hammam as the biblical site of Sodom.
Collins's claim that Hammam is Sodom is really quite a sensational claim. Now, I don't mean that as a pejorative. If he's right, it really would be quite a sensational thing. He's convinced that he's right, and many other people accept his argumentation and see the archaeological remains at Tall el Hammam as further proof that his argument is correct. Now, if that's you, then that's great. But oftentimes I think people hear a basic summary of sensational finds like this and accept them without investigating further. If someone tells you a credentialed archaeologist has found the biblical Sodom, it's where the Bible says it was destroyed by fire from heaven, and you can even see today the massive destruction associated with divine judgment, I can't blame you for thinking, oh, that's really cool. I mean, it sounds pretty cool to me too. But if you accept this model, there are some important implications that come from it that aren't always obvious at first glance, and in a sense they lock you into a very particular way of interpreting the biblical text. The first implication has to do with numbers and chronology in the Bible. The Bible has an internal chronology. Things are dated in relation to other things. The big events in the Old Testament are the Exodus, the construction of the Jerusalem temple, and the destruction of the first temple. The chronology of most other events are anchored to these three key events. Now, the dates given between those events may conform to our understanding of being historically accurate, as in the Exodus may have been 480 years prior to the construction of the temple, or the numbers given may have a symbolic or figurative interpretation. People often have very strong opinions on this, but there are a few valid ways of interpreting these numbers. A major contribution of archaeological work is that it has been able to anchor events in Israelite history to events outside of the Bible's internal history, which can now be reckoned onto our own calendar. For example, the destruction of the Kingdom of Israel is dated to 721 or 722. The siege of Jerusalem by Sennacherib is dated to 701. The destruction of the Jerusalem temple is dated to 586. These are events which are mentioned both within the Bible and outside the Bible in things like Assyrian and Babylonian records. And we're able to anchor the histories of these kingdoms through further linking with other cultures like Egypt, as well as reckoning from astronomical phenomena they observed and recorded. Some of the events they recorded can even be known through archaeological excavations and the dating techniques used within the field of archaeology. The siege of Lachish by the Assyrians, for example, is known from Assyrian sources and from archaeology. You can still see the Assyrian siege ramp at the site today. Excavations have produced artifacts and items which can be dated using our radioactive clocks, like radiocarbon, as well as being dated through standard ceramic ceration. So, with archaeology and ancient history, we aren't limited to just the three big events of the Hebrew Bible. But we can link more events from the Bible's internal chronology to events outside of it. Now, if you accept Tall el Hammam as Sodom, the date of that destruction is dated to the middle of the 17th century, around 1650 BC. Now, this would become one of those events that is locked in for the chronological sequence of Old Testament events. You're essentially saying Abraham lived in the mid-17th century. Now, that is certainly a position that you could take and defend, but it locks you into an interpretation of biblical numbers as non-literal. Again, it's a position that's defensible, but if you take the other numbers of the Bible as literal, then the life of Abraham would be earlier than the 17th century. Now, personally, I don't think all the numbers in the Old Testament should be interpreted as literal, but many people do. Even so, no matter how you interpret the numbers of the Bible, locking the destruction of Sodom into 1650 causes problems for most common biblical interpretations in a way that locking in dates like 586 or 722 doesn't. It is really hard to fit a 17th century date for Abraham, no matter how you view the numbers of patriarchal narratives in the Bible. This leads to a second problem with seeing Hammam as Sodom because of how Sodom is treated in other biblical sources. Collins' excavation shows Hammam was reoccupied after it was destroyed. The Bible strongly indicates that Sodom was not reoccupied. It also indicates the area around Sodom was no longer fertile. Now, this seems to be the implication of the parenthetical note in Genesis 13 that Lot saw a fertile area around Sodom, but this was prior to its destruction, implying that those reading the story after it was written would know the area around Sodom is no longer fertile. Zephaniah 2:9 prophesies the end of Moab and Ammon, saying that they will be like Sodom and Gomorrah, respectively, a land possessed by nettles and salt pits and a waste forever. Now, that's a pretty strong indication that Sodom, at the time of Zephaniah in the 7th century, or Iron 2b and c, was unoccupied. Isaiah prophesies the end of Babylon and says it will be like Sodom and Gomorrah, where even the nomads don't camp. The idea is that the area is desolate. It used to be fertile, but it was subjected to God's judgment, and it was ruined and never reoccupied. Jeremiah echoes this as well. Sodom was destroyed so that no man will live there. The Iron II occupation at Hammam would suggest the prophets were unaware of the reoccupation of the old city of Sodom. Now, one more minor note is that in Collins' view, Hammam was catastrophically destroyed by a large airburst from a meteor, and that this destruction was not limited to Hammam. Now, this was a rather indiscriminate blast that hit not only Hammam, but also sites like Jericho. And yet the biblical story seems to indicate nearby sites like Zoar were not destroyed. Lot seems to move quickly from Sodom to Zoar and finds safety there. So within the Genesis narrative itself, the destruction of Sodom seems to be more localized than generalized. Collins' theory for the means of destruction of Hammam may work, but it doesn't exactly fit the narrative as neatly as one might assume. Now, as a side note, we're not generally against seeing natural phenomena like meteor strikes or storms or earthquakes as the phenomena behind certain biblical episodes, but Collins' theory doesn't seem to be an exact fit here. As a final minor note, if Hammam isn't Sodom, it brings up the question of what Hammam was. It's one thing to say Hammam isn't Sodom, but can we offer a positive identification for the archaeological site with another ancient city? Well, yes we can. Kind of. Most scholars think Tall el Hammam is the biblical site of Abel Shittim, a name meaning meadow of acacias. It is mentioned in the Bible in Numbers, Joshua, and Micah, as well as in a few extra-biblical sources. This identification of Hammam works much better with the textual and archaeological evidence. So, for most people who take the Bible seriously, the acceptance of Hammam as Sodom creates some problems. This perhaps raises the question, if we don't buy Hammam as Sodom, then where could Sodom be?
Scholars have suggested a number of alternative sites for biblical Sodom with varying degrees of viability. I'll cover just a few possibilities. First is a city that is yet to be identified in the area north of the Dead Sea. Now, this view would accept Collins' historical geography in sort of broad strokes, that Sodom and Gomorrah ought to be placed in the area north of the Dead Sea. This still has some problems, though, given some intertextual links between Genesis 14 and later passages like 2 Chronicles 20. Still, it's a viable reading of the relevant text, and you could argue that perhaps Hammam is not the site, but another Middle Bronze Age site in the region might fit. Now, secondly, most scholars suggest Sodom was in the southern part of the Dead Sea, and some of you suggested it's under the Dead Sea. Now, there are several reasons cited for this, and even a few proposed sites. First, scholars have looked for the general location of the cities of the plain, of which Sodom and Gomorrah are two. Other sites like Zoar, to which Lot escapes, are better known. The Madaba map, which is a 6th century mosaic map in St. George's Church in Jordan, shows, among other things, a city labeled Zoar, which is on the east side of the Dead Sea, near the southern end. As we said, it seems Zoar is near Sodom within the narrative of Genesis, so it follows that Sodom may be near the southern end of the Dead Sea as well. Others have suggested that due to variability in the levels of the Dead Sea, the city may actually be buried under the southern part of it. Other sites not under the Dead Sea have been suggested, like Bab edh-Dhra, an early Bronze Age city that was destroyed in the EB3 around 2200 BC. In fact, not far from Bab edh-Dhra is a Byzantine monastery over what was remembered as Lot's Cave. So that area has a long tradition associated with Lot and the story of Sodom. Additionally, the nearby site of Numaira has been suggested, but both Bab edh-Dhra and Numaira were destroyed long before the time of Abraham by just about any kind of chronological framework one could reasonably use. No one I know of would put Abraham in the EB3. So there aren't a lot of really viable sites around the southern side of the Dead Sea that fit for Sodom, but it seems to be the right region. Perhaps the most dominant perspective on this issue is that the location of Sodom is in Genesis. It's in Genesis 13, 14, 18, and 19. If you want to find Sodom, it's right there in the text. In this view, Sodom is more of a folk legend or something that serves an etiological purpose. There's some textual support for this. For example, when Lot and Abraham separate in Genesis 13, Lot goes toward the Jordan Valley as the land was like a well-watered garden, and there is a note that this was before God destroyed Sodom. The implication seems to be that the region was materially and qualitatively different before and after the destruction of Sodom. It was well-watered and lush before, a kind of wasteland, or what it is now, after the destruction. The story then serves to explain why the land, particularly in the Arabah region in the southern end of the Dead Sea, is a wasteland, and even why it has a sulfuric quality. And it reinforces the severity of God's judgment. The land is almost literally God-forsaken wilderness still after all these years. Additionally, as there aren't really any great candidates for the site of Sodom in the area, only ones that are dated much earlier, the idea with this model is that people knew these cities existed but were destroyed a long time ago. How long ago wasn't clear, but they could see the ruins of these large cities in an exceptionally marginal land and, to be frank, terrible patch of land. They reasoned that something bad had to have happened to these cities, so the story of Sodom and Gomorrah cropped up like folk stories explaining why there were these giant ghost towns in a desert wasteland and why they were now abandoned and not occupied. So searching for Sodom may not be entirely productive. It may not have existed outside the folklore of the people of the ancient world. Now, which of these models is right is a matter of debate, but each model has data which can be used to support it, and I would suggest it's unwise to just toss out any of these theories without seriously considering all of them.
Now, we'll leave the question of the nature of the sin of Sodom to another time and place. For now, we'll focus on the archaeological questions presented by this publication. One big idea we want to highlight is the way archaeology is practiced in this publication, and many like it. It's a quest for realia, archaeological evidence that reinforces a particular interpretation of the biblical text rather than informing the way we read the text. And that quest for realia takes you to some weird places. Dogmatic readings of the text, that Sodom is a real city, Sodom is north of the Dead Sea, and Sodom is Hammam, lead to other readings most would not be comfortable with. Forcing the text and the data to fit our interpretation leads to errors in other places. Harmonizing Hammam with Sodom with the text takes other places out of harmony. We see this in the problematic dating of the age of the patriarchs that results from claiming that Hammam is the biblical Sodom. And there's also the divide of liberal and conservative scholars who generally disagree that Hammam is Sodom. The people who accept Hammam as Sodom are generally not archaeologists or especially familiar with the field. They may be apologists who don't know archaeology and just accept what Collins has said, or they may be influencers or podcast hosts who accept the sensational claims because it's good for clicks. They may also be church people who want the excavations to confirm their view. But it's just more complicated than that. The reality is more complex than the realia. One consequence of this approach to archaeology is that it unnecessarily places the text and science in an antagonistic relationship. Now, this article, on which Collins is admittedly not listed as an author, has been savaged by the academic community. Now, some critiques are better than others, but on the whole, this reaction unnecessarily places archaeology in an antagonistic relationship with the scientific community. While some in the scientific community are going to be antagonistic to anything biblical, not all are or will be. We should be endeavoring to do good work, including good scientific work, and when we force the data to fit our reading of the text, we end up in a bad spot. We can and should do the best work we can. We can have differing opinions on things, but we should still hold to high standards, no matter the field we're working in. Thanks for joining us for this Beneath the Bible video. If you want to learn more about this topic, be sure to check out our references and resources in the description below. If you enjoyed this video and you want to see more content like it, be sure to subscribe and check out our videos on the Mount Ebal curse tablet for more on the complicated relationship between archaeology and the biblical text. If you learned something new today, take a minute to share this video with your friends. And until next time, keep digging.